Thanks so much for sticking around for the fusion panel. Should be pretty exciting. It's one of those energies that it's been around for a long time, but maybe not completely understood. So I think we can get a little bit of enlightenment on where we stand right now. These three gentlemen on my right, you probably know Andrew Holland. He's with the American Security Project, Senior Fellow for Energy and Climate. Next to him is Steve Dean. He is the head of Fusion Power Associates and was able to join us, which we're very excited about. And finally, on the end, we have Mike Delage. He is with General Fusion, and he is the, actually, don't have your, what are you with General Fusion?
I'm the VP of Strategy and Corporate Development.
All right, the most important person, right? So we're going to have a few short presentations. We won't talk too much, we promise. We'll get right into the dialogue and make sure we get your questions answered. First, we're going to start with Andrew. He's going to give us a little bit about sort of where Fusion sits and what the work he's been doing with it at ASB.
Thanks, Kate. Since we are the last panel of the day, and I want to keep everybody with us and awake and everything like that, I think it's important that we make this kind of interactive, and so I'm not going to take too long, and I want to just kind of run through a couple of things. As I had said at the beginning of the day today, we set this up as okay, what are the things we need to be doing now? So that's why we were talking about natural gas and everything, and then progressing through towards talking about renewables and renewable transportation, and then what's next in nuclear power. And now we want to talk about what's next beyond that. What's the next generation of energy, and how do we get there? And for us here at the American Security Project, when we talk about next generation energy, one of the most important parts of that is talking about fusion. Fusion energy is literally, I think first it's important, even though I see a lot of people who know the basics and who've been around this for a while in the room. It's important to say what fusion is. Fusion is, it's literally the power of the stars. It's when you take two light atoms and heat them up under extreme heat pressure, they fuse together, and in that process to form a new element. The easy one is two atoms of hydrogen fusing together to form helium. In that process, a tremendous amount of energy is released. You use that energy to create electricity, and you can use it, as Mark had said in the previous panel on high temperature fission reactors, you can use that excess heat for a lot of interesting things as well. Fusion has been, research on fusion has been ongoing since the early 1950s. It was started under the Atoms for Peace program under Eisenhower, and the next question is always, oh well, if we've been doing fusion research for so long, how come we haven't gotten there? Well, a couple of reasons. One is it's very hard, it's very difficult science. Creating the ability to keep that plasma, that high temperature, high pressure plasma contained is quite difficult. It's a very difficult scientific problem. But also, the second point is that yes, we've been researching it for a long time. But I would say that the amount of research funding that has gone into it is not necessarily commensurate to the promise of it. So, we talk about here at ASP that fusion will have some real benefits. Why do we want to be doing this? Well, it's a clean source of power. No emissions from fossil fuels. We talked throughout the day about how do we get to a low emission source of power. It avoids the worst effects of climate change. It's the creation of a new high-tech industry. And I'd say it's important to note that, like we were talking about in the last panel, and I think like goes through a lot of the rest of this too, is that it's about American leadership. because if we're not making the investments, it doesn't mean that no one else is making the investments here. The rest of the world is going into this quite aggressively and quite quickly. I think if you just look at the projects that have been put forward and the plans that have been put forward in places like South Korea or China, the Chinese have built a couple of new fusion programs that are more modern and more up to date than ours. Now, everybody still says that our fusion scientists are more knowledgeable and more experienced, and that's true, but it only goes so far if we don't have the things, the machines to test them on. Steve's going to talk some about what's the status of fusion research, and I hope he'll talk a little bit about what's going on with ITER in France, and I'm happy to talk about that too. There are real technical hurdles here, but I think it's important to note that this is a real chance to get going and get moving on something that will provide benefits sooner than many have often thought. ASP has come out with a white paper that you all should go onto our website if you haven't seen it before, www.americansecurityproject.org. Fusion power in the 21st century, meeting the challenge, and we have a number of recommendations on how to get going and get moving forward. First is that we need to make sure that government funding is strong for this year and strong for the coming short term. So that means defending the fusion budget for this year in both the fusion energy sciences within the DOE as well as within the NNSA. But then we need to think about the long term, and I think this is the real problem with the United States, with a lot of things, but not just, but in fusion in particular, is that to have a real program, you need to be able to think long term, and scientists need to be able to plan long term. You need a real goal. And so we've put together in our white paper, it's a 10-year plan. Now, I don't say, and it's a mistake to say, that you can get a fusion power plant in 10 years. No, you can't. That's not credible. But you can do a lot in 10 years with increased funding and increased political will. You can do a lot, and you can get a long way towards where we need to go, and we can kind of enter the era of commercialization is the term for it. We have a couple of recommendations. We have 6 recommendations in our white paper. I'll name a couple. One is that this doesn't just need funding. It's easy to just say throw money at this. Our plan says $30 billion over 10 years, which, wow, that sounds like a lot of money, right? $30 billion. Well, that's $3 billion a year. $30 billion is the amount of money that the United States spends on energy in 1 week. So over 10-year time span, this is not that much money. The scale of the energy market is so vast that the amount of money there is not that much. But it's about more than just money. You can throw money at things, but if you don't have the political will, you don't have the political pressure to move forward with it. So one of our recommendations is that we should appoint a fusion power commissioner, somebody who can organize, streamline, lead the research with someone who is representative to the top levels of government. We have to pursue multiple and parallel research paths. So this is not about just down selecting and choosing one way forward. It's about ensuring that research goes in multiple directions. experiment with new and innovative power plant designs, and we'll hear from Mike Delage here with some of the new and innovative power plant designs. You know, and the final one is to make sure that we actively collaborate with private businesses and vendors, kind of similar to what we see with the defense industrial base. You know, there should be an active collaboration back and forth between DOE and private sector. I think that's an important way forward. I think I'm going to end there. You know, I'd just say that the ASP's support for fusion is, you know, this is an important way forward, an important sign of our leadership. It's an important way of thinking about how we think for the long term. Can we plan for something that is beyond any president's time in office? Can we plan for something that is beyond political terms? Unfortunately, I think the evidence shows right now that we can't. But you know, when we talk about these things, I think we need to be thinking about this for the long term, and I hope that we're getting there. And I really want to get into this more on questions. So I'm going to pass it over to Mike.
All right. Thanks very much. I've got a few slides to show, so I'll try and show you a bit of some imagery both on what we're doing at General Fusion, but also try and paint that within the landscape of the work that's going on in fusion and the larger projects that are going on. So I don't know how many of these we'll be able to see from the back of the room, but I'm going to try and show you some of these things. So the first one here, and often when you're out and talking about fusion, the first thing out of anybody's mouth is, oh yeah, I've heard about this. It's 20 years away, right? It's been 20 years away since 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I really think that gives fusion a bit of a bad rap. I don't know what promises were made in the 1970s, but if you actually look at the progress in terms of fusion energy produced, or the key metrics for fusion since the 1970s, they've advanced just about as fast as Moore's Law. And Moore's Law governs, you know, the power of the electronics, we say. So if you think about what's different about fusion today compared to the 1970s, it's just as different as the difference between your smartphone and the very first calculator you might have gotten 30, 40 years ago. Now, you'll notice on the graph, if you can see, that the fusion line sort of stops around the year 2000. It's not that progress stopped, but what we've seen since then is we've seen some much, much larger initiatives in terms of projects, and the biggest one is one called ITER, being built in France, and that's a multinational organization and effort. And with that kind of institution and program comes its own set of challenges, and certainly ITER has had its share of problems and programmatic delays, but it's not really about the technology that is causing the delay. It has much more to do with the way these things have been organized. Within fusion, there are two main approaches that have been pursued for that period of time. And really, since the 1970s, the research has gone into these two areas for various reasons. One is called magnetic fusion, and the project in France called ITER is the latest example of that. And that's really like a big magnetic bottle. So we're going to put our hydrogen gas into a chamber, we're going to heat it up, and then we're going to contain it with magnetic fields. We have to heat our gas to 150 million degrees to make fusion. That's a temperature which no material can withstand. So you need to confine it some other way, and so we're going to use magnetic fields, and the magnetic fields will protect it from hitting the wall. The challenge is we can only make magnetic fields that are so strong, and so we can only contain a plasma that is so dense if we want to do it at steady state. And therefore, we need to make a big machine that holds the plasma together for long, long periods of time. And so ITER and magnetic fusion operates at a fairly low density of plasma, so the reaction rate is low. The atoms don't hit each other that often. At the other end of the scale is laser fusion, or its technical name term is inertial confinement fusion. And they're not worried about trying to hold the heat in at all. They're trying to take a small pellet of fusion fuel, and they fire the world's biggest laser systems at it, and they crush that pellet to about 1,000 times the density of a solid in a billionth of a second. So at that extreme density, the reaction rate is really, really, really fast, and they're basically just driving energy into the fuel faster than it can possibly come out for any known mechanism. And those are the two main approaches that have been pursued. The National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore National Labs is the main approach, or the largest facility for laser fusion in the world. But between those two is a difference of about 10 trillion units. It's a pretty astounding number when you think about it. If you think about a 1 pound water bottle that was 10 trillion pounds, I mean, it's a massive, massive range. And so rather than these being the only two approaches that you can look at for fusion, you can actually start to think about the fact that there's probably an opportunity to look at doing fusion at intermediate densities with some magnetic confinement. And that's what general fusion is doing. That's what a number of new initiatives are about. And if, for those who've followed it, ARPA-E has recently announced a project that they're going to fund that is interested in advancing the technology for fusion in this intermediate regime. And so we're pretty excited about that because it's something we've been trying to say for a while, that there's opportunities for fusion technology in this intermediate regime. And certainly we're not alone. There's a project at Sandia National Lab called Magliff, which last year announced some first promising results. It uses the Z machine, pretty impressive pulse power facility at Sandia. And they were successful in achieving some significant neutron yields of fusion reactions late last year, and they just published that recently in Scientific Journal. Outside of the National Lab system, there's something interesting going on in fusion right now. And it really is that general fusion, and we're not alone in this, is one of a number of new companies that either have formed or companies that are investing in fusion technologies around alternative approaches. So there was an article in Science about a month and a half ago, maybe 2 months ago now, and I just thought I'd read you the introduction to that article. It said, "Something strange is happening in the world of fusion energy research. There's been an outbreak of entrepreneurship, maverick independence, and pioneering spirit. In unassuming industrial units across North America, Europe, and elsewhere, small teams of scientists and engineers, supported by either private finance or a mix of government and private funds, are working out novel approaches to fusion. They're not just doing research, they're aiming to build financially viable power reactors simpler and cheaper than anything envisioned by publicly funded efforts, and they're hoping to do it a whole lot faster." Now, nobody's saying that this is without risk, but it is interesting to see this happening right now. And you have to wonder, what is it about this moment? What are the technologies that have been brought to light? So I'm going to talk a bit about our story at General Fusion and what we're doing. And this is our design for our reactor. It's a 100 megawatt net electric reactor design. The company itself is about 12 years old, so it started in 2002. We're based in Vancouver, and we're about 60 people. And the idea here is that intermediate regime. And how do we achieve that intermediate regime? Well, we're going to take some plasma, some hot gas, and wrap it in a magnetic field. But a bit like a smoke ring, it'll hold itself together for a small period of time, and then it dissipates and fizzles out. While it has that structure, while it has that magnetic field around it, we're going to compress it violently. And that compression, a bit like a diesel engine, is going to heat it up to fusion conditions, and we'll achieve a burst of fusion at peak pressure. So our reactor looks like this. It's a central sphere, it'll be about 10 feet across, surrounded by a huge array of pneumatically driven pistons. And inside that sphere, we're going to put molten metal, molten lead lithium. We'll pump it so that it's spinning around inside the sphere, a bit like water going down the drain. And as it spins around, that opens a hole in the center. Into that hole, we can inject our plasma from the top and the bottom. If you can see it, I don't know if it's running, but the large cone-shaped devices at the top and the bottom will inject plasma. And all around the sphere, this big array of pistons are like big jackhammers. So simultaneously, they're going to impact and create a pressure wave from the outside of the sphere into the center. And as it focuses in the middle, it gets extremely strong, collapsing the vortex and compressing the plasma at the center. You get a burst of fusion reaction happening. The energy goes into the liquid metal. The metal heats up. You take that heat, you boil water and make steam and drive a turbine. And that looks a lot like the rest of the power plant that we're familiar with. Some of that steam makes electricity. Some of the steam we're going to use to run the pistons on the next pulse. So we recycle some of the energy in the form of steam. And really what we did when we started out to do this is we looked around at a lot of both new and old ideas around fusion. And a lot of these concepts actually go back a number of years to a project out of the Naval Research Lab here in the United States. And the elements that go into this are quite practical. So steam driver, compressed gas driver that allows us to use the power plant working fluid instead of having to turn it all to electricity and charge big capacitor banks or lasers. thick liquid metal blanket, makes it easy to extract the heat, and importantly, it protects our structure. So all of the fusion that happens in the center is surrounded by 1.5 meters of molten lead when it happens, and that makes a big, big difference in terms of any structural damage. And lastly, we're able to have a pulse system where we're running 1 pulse per second, like the laser fusion approach, but we don't have any targets that we're destroying. The only thing that makes up our target that we're compressing is the fuel itself, so we're not destroying anything. And that means there's not as much in the way of consumables. So these kind of aspects help make it a little more practical. I'm just going to skip this slide. We're not just doing pretty pictures. We're building hardware and testing hardware. And so this is a plasma injector at our laboratory. It's at full scale. We're designing these to achieve the temperature and density and time of confinement that we need in that green plasma in order to make it work. We're also working on subsystems with the compression technology. So in a full-scale machine, we would have some 200 pistons around a 10-foot sphere. This is a 14-piston system, still full-scale pistons around about a 3.5-foot sphere. With a liquid metal vortex, which you can see spinning in the bottom, and we've been working to show we can get the symmetry and the compression to the point we need it. And this is what makes this possible to do today. I mentioned some of these ideas go back 30, 40 years. It's modern electronics, modern materials that mean we can take a stab at these things today where we couldn't have done it 30, 40 years ago. As a company, we've raised about $50 million, so we are mostly privately funded. That does make us a bit unusual in the world of fusion. A lot of these are venture capital firms, but you'll also recognize some interesting investors like Jeff Bezos. And one I wanted to highlight, especially given this conversation before, is Cenovus Energy, which is a Canadian oil sands company. So the ideas around new markets for nuclear technology in general being in heat applications certainly plays there. They're burning an awful lot of natural gas to get oil out of the oil sands. Jacques Bisnanu introduced himself. He's one of our members of our board of directors, and we're pleased to have him here too. But we've worked very hard to bring together a board of directors and advisors that brings a lot of industry experience to the table. Okay, I wanted to give you a sense of what you can do in a private opportunity compared to maybe what people are used to in timelines and national labs. So while the company was started in 2002, it took a lot of years to do some proof of principle experiments and eventually to raise venture capital. So in July of 2009, the company was still only 3 or 4 people. This is about what it looked like. Today, you've seen some pictures. We're 60 people. We made a huge amount of progress in just over 4.5 years as we go. And this is the kind of thing that you can do when you're able to leverage a private sector model. And we're not alone in this. There are a number of other companies. As the Science article called us, the restless pioneers. And I wanted to talk a bit about some of the other companies out there you may or may not have heard of. A lot of them are here in the States, Helion Energy in Washington State, Trialpha Energy in California. They've raised hundreds of millions of dollars for their program. Tokamak Energy is in the UK. EMC2 or EMC Energy Matter Conversion Corporation has been funded by the Navy for a number of years. Lockheed Martin announced a year and a half ago that they have an internal fusion research program out of Skunk Works. That's pretty interesting to see a company that is known for looking down the road about technologies that are important and investing their own R&D dollars in doing that. And all of these labs and all of these companies, they're not doing these in isolation. They are working with national labs. So these are credible scientists. The pace of innovation is quickly moving forward, and this is really new, and it's interesting to see it happening right now. And I would say it's an opportunity to nurture, because if we are going to get to fusion in the next 10 to 20 years, and I think it's possible, it's going to come from these kind of efforts, and so that's the opportunity that we face. I hope we can get there.
All right, great. Thanks, Mike. And just real quickly, we're going to go to Steve, and maybe you can give us an overview. ITER's been mentioned a few times, maybe a little bit about the domestic program as well, and sort of how the two are actually connected, although little was known about that.
Well, thank you. I'm a last-minute addition to the panel. I wasn't advertised in the brochure that brought you all here. I sent in an email here yesterday to Andrew, or maybe it was this morning. It was yesterday, how many people are you expecting? He said, well, 250 people have registered. And I said, well, I know your conference room. No, 150. I said, how are you going to fit all those people in this conference room of yours? He says, well, they won't all be here at the same time. So first thing I want to do is thank you all for staying as being the last speaker the last day. The other thing is that since I am a last minute addition, we didn't have a chance to coordinate at all as to what topics we're going to cover. And I want to thank Mike for doing an excellent job on all the things that I thought I might have to say to introduce you to the general topic. As Mike said, there are really three distinct groups, if you might say, or areas or approaches to fusion. There's the magnetic confinement, there's the inertial confinement laser area, and there are these group of what we traditionally call alternate concepts. People who don't fit in with the mainstream and always coming up with ideas that irritate the sponsor and irritate the mainline scientists and engineers working on the program. And one of their characteristics is they can always do it faster and cheaper and smaller than what the mainline people are doing. And it's an interesting phenomenon, as I think Mike has pointed out, that these groups, that he put a bunch of them up there, they're just in the last few years starting to get some recognition that maybe they're not just a bunch of crazies, and maybe they have something that needs to be taken seriously. The sponsors of the main programs in the government have not taken them seriously. But they have been successful to some degree of raising some money in the private sector. And I think that's a great phenomenon that's in process right now. I'll give you a little bit of background on myself. I've been in fusion for over 50 years. And just last year I published a book called Search for the Ultimate Energy Source. It's a history of the fusion program. And it traces some of the phenomenon of starts and stops, promises and failures and so on over the years. For example, in the 1970s and going into the early 80s, we had under construction at Princeton what we call the tokamak fusion test reactor. And it was a physics test reactor that was going to produce the conditions and plasma conditions that you would need to make net energy in fusion. And we built it, and we thought maybe it would succeed, by the mid-80s. And it actually took an additional 10 years of scientific research on the machine to bring it up to its full capacity. And it did make like 10 megawatts of fusion energy, not electricity, but it made 10 megawatts of fusion energy, but it was only designed to hold that energy for a few seconds. And of course, to get to fusion power, you have to hold that kind of energy for continuously, basically. So that machine operated, and because of that kind of success, Congress got interested in the program, and we put together a program plan. And Congress passed in 1980 what was called the Magnetic Fusion Engineering Act of 1980, and it said for $20 billion in 20 years, we'll put electricity on the grid from fusion in a demonstration power plant in 20 years. And a lot of people now, many years later, are saying, what happened to that game plan? Well, let me tell you one thing that happened. As we entered, and the Fusion Power Associates that I'm head of was founded in 1979 to try to help make that transition happen from the scientific program to an engineering and development program that could put fusion energy on the grid by the year 2000. Well, one of the things that we did in the 70s and into the early 80s was we designed what we called an engineering test reactor. And if you look at those conceptual designs now, you can't hardly tell them the difference between those designs and what's being built now in France, which is called ITER. I noticed out here on the desk here area, they have several copies of this brochure on ITER, and I don't know if you can see it, but here's what's going on in France. There's a huge international project building this engineering test reactor. Now, back in the 1980 Act, we said this reactor was going to be built during the 1980s and operate in 1990. But it's being built now, and it's not going to operate until the year 2020. So something went went wrong in this plan. And what happened was, in the 1980s, the first thing that happened was that the Congress and the new administration really wasn't interested in funding the program at the level that you could go into construction on something like this. And in 1985, Ronald Reagan and President Gorbachev from the Soviet Union had a summit meeting, and they said, "Oh, let's us build it together, this engineering test reactor. And we'll build it with the Europeans." So we said, okay, well, the Russians, the Americans, and the Europeans, we will band together, and yes, we haven't started it yet, but we'll design it in the rest of the 80s, and we'll build it in the 1990s, and we'll have this engineering test reactor running by the year 2000. Well, what happened? They went into the 1990s, and instead of building it, they kept designing it. And they designed it, and they redesigned it. But the other thing they did was, they started inviting other countries to come in. So they brought in the Japanese, they brought in the Koreans, they brought in the Chinese, they eventually brought in the Indians, and the government people in all these countries. They started working out all of the legal documents as to how could such a thing work, and who would be in charge, and so on and so forth, and where would it be designed, and where would it be built, and all of these things. This took up the entire decade of the 1990s, so instead of building it, by the end of the 1990s, they had this big organization, but they still hadn't decided where was it going to be built. So then they had like a 3-year argument as to where was it going to be built. The Japanese wanted to build it, and the Europeans wanted to build it, and the US said, no, we don't want to build it. And the reason we don't want to build it here was because the country, was all agreed in this process that the country where it was sited was going to pay half the bill. And of course, the U.S. didn't want to pay half the bill. They wanted to pay the minimum amount of the U.S. contribution. So the U.S., when that was going on, the Canadians were interested in having it in Darlington at the Ontario Hydro nuclear power plant site. And they wanted to propose that site jointly with the U.S. But the U.S. said, no, we're not going to do that, because we'd still have to pay too much money if we were the joint owners of this thing up in Canada. So it was around 2003 then, by the time everybody agreed where it was going to be built and how the organization was going to be set up. And for the rest of that period of the 2000s up until a few years ago, people were banding together, getting offices over in France where it was decided to build it, sending people over from all the parties, figuring out who had what jobs from which countries, and so on and so forth. Well, it turned out that the job was a huge job. The machine, as I showed you, there are pictures of it in this brochure. It's behind schedule, it's over budget, but it is being built. And the latest official date for first operation is 2020, but most people in the project think it's going to slip at least a few more years from that by the time they get it all sorted out. Nevertheless, the machine itself would be the first machine that's going to make more fusion energy than was put into the machine to operate. It has superconducting magnets. It's going to run for 15 minutes at a time. It's possible to upgrade this machine later to a steady state. It's going to make 500 megawatts of thermal power. So it's a very major step beyond where the program was going to be. Nevertheless, it's going to be in the early 2020s and not the year 1990 when this machine operates. So what comes after that? Well, in the other countries, especially in Korea and China, they're already designing the demonstration power plant. They've already got serious design teams. They already got plans published. The Europeans have also published plans that as soon as the ITER operates and all the experience of building all the hardware is in hand in all these countries, they are going to start serious engineering, design, and construction of a demonstration power plant and have that power plant running. Various people have various schedules, somewhere between 2035 and 2050. These other parties all say they're going to be running a demonstration power plant of the magnetic variety, of which the tokamak, which was originally invented in Russia, is going to be the favored design machine. So that's a little bit of history as to why we aren't farther along than we are, but how we are still making the progress and almost we're on track internationally, if not domestically. Domestically, it's a sad story that the U.S. Congress and the U.S. government basically has not wanted the U.S. to get into the engineering aspect of it. The U.S. program has lost touch with its customer. In 1985, in Fusion Power Associates, we had a dozen electric utilities. We had about 20 major companies, all who wanted to get involved in fusion. But as the utilities were deregulated, and as it became clear that the U.S. wasn't going to do engineering, most of the industries lost interest, and most of the utilities lost interest. So what we have here in the U.S. is a fusion program that's anchored in what the Department of Energy calls its Office of Science. That means that we will do the scientific work, but we will not do the engineering work, we will not do the technology development work, we will not plan for building a fusion demonstration power plant in the U.S. on any kind of a time schedule. So in my book, I conclude, yes, we can probably get a fusion demonstration power plant putting out electricity by around 2050, but it's not likely to be in the U.S. It's most likely to be in Korea or China or possibly in Europe. Now the other major area, this is all funded in the Office of Science at the Department of Energy. And what we said 15 years ago when all this transition was happening was that the Department of Energy was converting our program from an energy program to a science program. And that's what it is today, and that's where, as far as we can tell at the moment, it's going to remain, because even with respect to this international project, the Senate recently in their Appropriations Committee is saying, hey, the cost of this is going up, we don't really want to pay the original cost, let alone the new cost. And so in the House and Senate Appropriations, they actually put out a bill that said that we're going to get out of this altogether, let the other parties do it. That bill never got out of committee, it just got out of subcommittee. Now we're on the continuing resolution. We're going to wait for the omnibus appropriation probably, and nobody knows whether the U.S. is going to get out of this project or stay into this project. My own projection is, since we've got good support in the House, that we will stay in this project in the omnibus, but the Senate may raise this question again during appropriations hearing next spring. The other major area that was mentioned by Mike is inertial confinement laser fusion. We have in the U.S. out at Livermore the world's largest, most powerful laser. It was designed to what we call ignite a pellet. It's called the National Ignition Facility, NIF. It started operation in 2009 with high confidence that very quickly they would ignite a pellet. Ignition to them meant that you'd make as much fusion energy released as the laser energy that it was putting into the machine. After 3 years, end of 2012, which was when they promised the Congress that was the latest they would ignite the pellet, they hadn't done it. They had made it about 1/100th of the energy of the laser in the pellet. They've gone back to the drawing boards to try to understand exactly why the pellet isn't performing the way they think. Everybody thinks that eventually they'll figure it out, but they haven't figured it out yet, and it's now 2 years later than 2012. Could happen next week, could happen next month, could happen 5 years from now. Nobody knows, but in the meantime, what has happened is that the people that were really interested in this for going forward to an energy program have had to calm down. The project is in the weapons laboratory. It's funded in the Department of Energy out of the weapons budget. So they've turned this machine over to the weapons community at Livermore, and they are using this machine to study weapons physics, meaning that they are studying the phenomenon of what goes on in the explosion of a hydrogen bomb to help them with maintaining the stockpile. So that's the status of that. There are other countries like Japan in particular, and the Chinese that are in this big. The French also are building a laser that's very similar to the laser out of Livermore. It's not quite in operation yet, but it will be soon. It is also part of the French weapons program. So there is a potential there. It is not moving along quite as fast as everybody would like. And then, as Mike mentioned, in the past month, after about a year of thinking about it, Another part of Department of Energy, ARPA-E, Advanced Research Project Energy, has finally decided after several years to put out a request for proposals for alternate fusion concepts. And they have decided to pick this intermediate density regime that Mike mentioned. As he mentioned, there are several groups around the country that are interested in this regime. It's been going on at Los Alamos, it's been going on at Sandia, it's been going on at General Fusion. I might mention that in Fusion Power Associates, most of our members have transitioned, our membership has transitioned from mostly industries and utilities to now all our members almost, except for General Atomics and Schaefer, are the major national laboratories and the major universities that are working on fusion. But we have a group of what we call small business affiliates, and we're very proud that General Fusion is one of our small business affiliates. And every December we have a management level symposium here in Washington, and they've been presenting their ideas, and several other small companies have been presenting their ideas alongside the presentations of the major fusion approaches. So that's kind of a little bit of the history. If anybody's interested in my book, I have a few copies available here at half the price that the publisher wants for it. Unfortunately, the publisher listed it at $120 a copy, so even at half price, it's $60. I apologize for that, but I had no control over how much the publisher decided to charge for the book. It's a pretty good history, I think.
It's a good book. It's a good book. I read it.
And
I read it and I read it.
it's not a really highly technical book. There's no equations in it. It's a lot of the political history of some of which I described in here, of who shot us in the foot when, which energy secretaries came in and wanted to kill the program and then changed their minds 6 months later after they'd killed part of the program. We've had a rough political history in fusion. We have starts and stops. Part of this has to do with the nature of the U.S. government. You know, we change administrations every now and then, and new administrations always want to get rid of what the old administration liked and start over again. We have Congress that changes from time to time. You know, they like this one year, they don't like that another year. All things considered, however, since the program's been going since 1950 and has still survived, you have to say that we've had pretty good support, even if we haven't gotten the budget policies that we've wanted. We've survived Republican administrations and Democratic administrations. We've had good support from both at various times. At various times we've been attacked by people in various parties. So, you know, we're not lined up with any particular party, that's for sure. But I'm hopeful that between the magnetic program and the international program on ITER, between the laser work either here or elsewhere, or between some of these upstart groups that are looking for a faster, better way to do it, they'll get support either from ARPA-E or privately funded, and that from out of these three areas of potential areas of fusion operation for machines, we'll find something that eventually can go commercial. I have to say that the bulk of the fusion program is disconnected from its customer. You almost never see an electric utility person come to any of our meetings anymore. Nobody talks to them about the fact that some of our concepts are so expensive that the electric utility person probably couldn't come up with the capital in the capital markets to pay for the thing. If you talk to the major people in the government's programs, not many of them will tell you that they want to try to find a cheaper, better, faster way to get the job done. They pretty much go the path of least resistance from a physics and scientific point of view. So that's about my comments.
Great. Well, now you guys have a lot of cocktail fodder, so that'll be helpful. I'm going to do a few questions here, and then we'll go right to your questions. I was curious, Mike, given what Steve said, how much does this sort of uneven funding in the U.S. Sort of affect what General Fusion is doing and what some of the startups are doing, and then is it sort of make you look elsewhere when you're trying to look for partners or funding or collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, there's two sides to that. One, I'll say that we don't get private investment unless unless a lot of scientific due diligence gets done in the company. So where do they do that? Well, they turn to people that are in the mainstream fusion programs to do that due diligence. And so we've been fortunate to have a lot of people in the mainstream fusion programs when they take a deep look at the science that we're doing. They come back and say, you know, this is a pretty good idea. That said, the next step is how do you collaborate with the groups? And the expertise, as Steve said, is it sits a lot in national labs, and so but programs like RBE help, and they haven't really been around up until now, is they help provide the catalyst for collaboration on that front. So there's some funding there that we can use to leverage, hopefully up into a broader collaboration and bring additional private dollars to the table. And we can use that to get access to the expertise that exists in the national labs. And we've worked with the groups at Los Alamos and other places over the years. But not wanting to sort of say, hey, we want this piece of money that's going over there. The really big lift that government gets when you look at what some of these smaller companies going is the leverage. And it doesn't take huge dollars to be able to do that. And it makes a really big difference on our side.
The Fusion Energy Sciences Committee just put out a very fascinating report that gives out a 10-year strategy for the domestic energy programs, and it definitely emphasizes collaboration a lot. Steve or Andrew, did you have anything? Was there something particular about the report that was important, or the fact that they have a 10-year plan now, which was that they didn't have before, sort of signals as it was requested from them?
I'll give it to Steve here in a second, but I think this was a congressionally mandated report. They said they needed a 10-year plan, but it's only a draft so far, so we can't really comment too much on it until the draft is complete. But there's some good parts and some less good parts.
Yeah, I think that is an important point to make, that the DOE has an advisory committee called Fusion Energy Sciences Advisory Committee, and they met last week to consider the draft report of a panel that they put together to prepare a 10-year strategic plan that was requested by Congress. It is a draft plan. They did not approve it at the meeting. The members of the PSEC, it's called, asked for a number of changes to be made, and those changes are in fact supposedly being made right now, and they are scheduling a public conference call on October 10th to consider the changes in the draft plan and see if they can agree on approving it and sending it back to DOE. The other thing to emphasize is that plan, even when it's done and approved by the PSEC, is not the plan for the program, because the Department of Energy is taking that as input to making a plan that they're going to make internally in the department. And then they are going to run that through the OMB and the OSTP, and then with the president's budget, the real plan will come over. And
then Congress has to weigh in on it.
Yes.
Congress has to determine.
So whether the department's plan will look exactly like the PSEC plan, nobody knows. I was not impressed with the plan. I've been quoted in Nature magazine as not being impressed by the plan. And the problem I have with the plan is they say that the plan is that in 10 years, the U.S. will continue to be a world leader in fusion. Well, if you look at what they proposed to do with the budgets they were given, we will not be the world leader in fusion. The program that's being laid out is a scientific program. There's very little engineering or technology in it. And so it looks to me like a plan, if it's implemented, that we're becoming a support program for the other parties who are going to do engineering development and try to build a fusion demonstration plan. So we're becoming a scientific support program for the Koreans and the Chinese and the Europeans and the Japanese in particular. So I don't like this plan. I don't think it's ambitious enough, but they were told by DOE, don't give us an ambitious plan. Don't tell us what you'd really like to do and how much it will cost. Tell us what you could do under these budgets that we're going to give you. And the worst case is that you don't get any more money than you've got now, and the best case is you get cost of living. So It's not the plan that the community would like. It's a plan that the OMB will like, and it's not a plan that I think puts us or keeps us in leadership in the World Fusion Program, which is passing us by. In the 1970s and 80s, the US program was half the world effort. No one could compare with the machines we had, with the people we had. Now we're at best 20% of the world effort. The European program is twice the size of our program, and the Korean and Chinese programs are growing like leaps and bounds. We haven't built a new machine really in this program in 30 years. The Koreans and the Chinese have just put online a couple of years ago a superconducting tokamak that's a world-class machine that we don't have anything comparing to it. And the Department of Energy's attitude is, well, we're just going to send our people over there to work. It's not going over very big with our scientists who don't really want to just pack up and go spend the rest of their working career working in China or Korea. But that's the DOE's plan right now for the fusion program.
Mike, there's a couple interesting things happening in the startup world, including someone trying to crowdfund a fusion project. I read a few, I guess there's 15 teenagers in the world that have actually managed to create fusion in their garages. So it sounds, it's very different than sort of the picture you get from ITER, which is obviously billions in many countries and governments. So what are the barriers that startups are facing, I guess, in trying to achieve this, other than probably the obvious, which is funding?
Yeah, well, I would distinguish, I mean, and I've met some of those guys who build fusers in their basements. It's one thing to essentially take a picture tube, like your old picture tube TV, and point the beams at each other and get some fusion reactions to happen, but there's no way to make energy in that way. I like to make that distinct from the companies that are getting funded, where really the difference is they're starting from an idea that says, well, I need to make a practical power plant. How am I going to make a practical power plant? And I'm going to go down a path that can allow me to get there. And the science to get there may be a little less proven, but if I can prove that science and I can do that on a more modest budget, then I can bring the timetable to commercial fusion forward by maybe a decade or two or more. So that's what we're doing. That's what Tri-Alpha is doing. That's what Helion's doing. That's what EMC Squared is doing. That's even what Lockheed Martin is trying to do. Now, what are the big challenges? The first big challenge is credibility, and Steve sort of referred to it as alternative concepts within the fusion community. And I would argue, too, that amidst the political challenges that have been, the fusion community has not done itself too many favors sometimes over the years, because different groups seem to like to throw stones at each other. And I'm not sure at times if I was a politician I would wade into that either. I think the reality is that the technology's come a long way, and what we're seeing with these private companies, I think, is the first waves of private industry saying, there may be an opportunity now. We're getting beyond some of these big scientific questions. It's getting more into the engineering, and maybe I can get out in front of this and see a really, really big win. But credibility is the biggest challenge, and so we've spent a lot of time working with groups like Steve's and in the scientific community at academic conferences, building relationships with the scientists who are going to do the due diligence for our potential investors so that they can understand what we're doing, appreciate that it's science-based, and understand the physics in mind what we're proposing to do. I would say that's the number one hurdle. The second one is, of course, timelines. In a world where you can put 12 guys in a room and give them $1 million, and a year later you've got Instagram that sells for $1 billion, it can be tough to attract venture capital, private investment for the energy sector. And that's not just us, that's a problem all through the energy sector. So this is where there are programs in Canada. We've had Sustainable Development Technology Canada, which has been a nice grant provider for us, and we've been able to leverage that up. That's where some of those helping up can really make a difference on the financing side and catalyze private industry getting to the table.
Okay, great. Well, now it's your turn. Is there a mic?
There is a mic in the back there.
Okay, great. The gentleman with the lovely library tie there.
Mark Haynes. All good presentations, and Mike, I appreciate the fact you were quite even-handed across the alternate concepts. But about, just to use yours as an example, can you talk about your roadmap and what the sort of major stepping stones are, and how much it costs to get to them. How much and when you get to a demo or a pilot, whatever you're calling it.
Well,
An ultimate.
Sure. The resolution on how much and when gets the less precise the further out you go. We've raised $50 million in private capital to date, and there's a further $20 million of public Canadian government funding through various R&D funds and so on that have come into the company. And that funding today is all about doing three things. One, we want to build key subsystems at scale. So we want to prove we can build the pieces. We can do that on the kind of budgets we do, and there's a lot of risk reduction that we need to do in that. So that's kind of the learning on how do we go build a first full-scale, complete integrated machine. Secondly, we want to do a number of experiments to understand the physics of what's going on in the core of our plant. So this intermediate regime, and what ARPA-E is trying to get at too, is the fact that it's less explored. And for those who know the details, fusion lives off of what are known as scaling laws, which basically says, look, as I heat up and I get closer and closer to the conditions for break even, how does this plasma behave? How fast does the heat come out? It's very, very, very difficult to simulate that from first principles, and so you build experimentally derived scaling laws. Well, in this intermediate regime, those laws aren't as well evolved, and we need to understand those. The third thing we want to do is on the simulation side, though, is to build the simulation tools that we need that are going to be the tools we need to build that first prototype machine. So all those three things is the funding we have now and some continued support. And we think that'll take another 2 to 3 years of effort to get through that phase, at which point we want to embark on the design and construction of a first full-scale machine. Now, we have a pulsed reactor design and a power plant that will run 1 pulse per second. The first one we build will be 1 pulse per day. It'll be a single shot at a time type machine. And by doing that, we can operate at full-scale physics on each pulse, but we can reduce the cost tremendously. So we're talking an $100 million capital cost. For that kind of an effort, and it's a multi-year project. From there, I think it really depends on the model we're pursuing. So it depends on, is it General Fusion that continues to take this forward, or where does industry start to play a role? I'll be the first to admit we don't know how to build 30-year reliable power plants. That's the domains of the Westinghouses and the Arevas and the GEs, and we're already talking with those kind of companies about how can we collaborate over time. And I think what happens next will come from there. But you should imagine it's going to be of the scale of the kind of efforts that are going on in the SMR program that's going to take to commercialize this.
Hello, Keith Bradley, Argonne National Laboratory. So I want to begin by congratulating everybody on the panel. First of all, thank you so much for carrying the torch for fusion. I think it's critically important to the future of the globe. I think it's still a long ways off, and that was addressed earlier. But I also want to thank, in particular, both Michael and Steve for pointing out that I think our nation, as well as others, have invested too much in two concepts that are clearly proven, that we're maybe on the wrong path, certainly not there today. And I think that the community needs a breakthrough. I think that the nation and the globe need to wake up and realize that we have to look at this in ways different than we have been looking at it. My question, in particular to Michael, is the following. If you look at the more traditional approaches to fusion, especially in pulse fusion, the next machine was always believed to overcome the barriers of plasma and hydrodynamic instabilities, that we were going to, that those threats to actually achieving ignition and eventually break-even were going to be overcome. What is it about magnetized target fusion and your company's approach that you believe will avoid that bugaboo that so many of the previous attempts have done?
Well, without getting into the detail, that's one of the reasons why what I say that what we're doing at the current phase is experimentation around the core, is we want to demonstrate that as close to break-even as we can get explicitly the physics of that, so we understand the scale that we need. And there are ways to do that without having to build a full-scale machine, given the approach we're taking. So that is a big issue and risk, and that could affect the scale. I mean, this is the problem, is that one of the ways you can win in fusion is fusion generally works better bigger. So if all else fails, build a bigger machine. Well, bigger machines cost more money and you lose in the economics. So the goal here is to understand that. And And we've been hopefully relatively conservative, or at least honest, in the physics we've assumed to date, but certainly it's a risk. We'll see when we get there. Again, what we're doing is about finding a way to test a new path as quickly as possible, because that new path could lead to a much more practical approach for power plant.
I might add to that this is maybe oversimplifying, but in the tokamak type of device, you're running at lower density, and in addition to the normal magnetohydrodynamics of collisional plasmas, you've got fine scale stuff going on that's enhancing transport, and particles are getting out. In inertial, you have the high density, but because of the very small scale, even small imperfections foul up your magnetohydrodynamics. But in this intermediate regime, which was pioneered really at Los Alamos theta pinches and things, the plasmas tend to behave very classically. And therefore, one hopes and thinks that one can compute and see that the instabilities and things like that are more manageable. I might also add, along as we've got you here being recognized again, that I should have mentioned that in the late 70s and early 80s, when we had designs which were very similar to ITER being designed in our labs, a lot of those designs were coming out of Argonne. And Argonne used to have a very solid fusion program. And that's one of the losses that's to the program, and there's been a number. As the budgets didn't go up, the program narrowed down both in concepts that they supported and in the number of institutions that they were supporting.
Thank you. Creighton Jones, 21st Century Science and Technology. This is principally directed at Mr. Dean, since you've been in the game for over 30 years. And what you've seen, can you speak to what you think the effect has been of a lack of investment in fusion, of not pushing the frontiers of science, what the effect's been on the next generation of scientists and engineers in the United States? I mean, I would imagine has been somewhat crippling in terms of, are we producing the level and number of scientists that we should be? And what effect has not moving forward this program had on that?
Well, one of the strange things about the present past policy of the government in fusion, which is to emphasize the science, is that they tended to protect the university programs and focus on the scientific work. But by not moving ahead on the practical applications aspects of fusion, the university students have been less interested in the field. And so there's a problem of getting the new people into the program, even if there were programs in the universities that were being supported. And the other thing about this is when I was in the universities, our professors were very interested in what the power plants were going to look like and how are we going to get the fusion and what does fusion look like. You don't see that in the universities anymore. What you see is the people that are coming out, they're happy if they're going to make their career studying very fine scale, detailed things about plasma physics. And most of them have never tried to design what would take to make energy from fusion. So we're missing a whole cadre of people who used to know how to invent fusion concepts to people who basically know how to go to plasma physics meetings and publish papers.
I'd add too that ASP is currently engaged in a broader project going around the country and talking about climate change, energy security, and national security, and how they're all interrelated. And you know, one of the things that comes out of this, and we've spent a lot of times at universities and colleges talking to you know, the next generation, as you said, and there's a huge demand to want to solve this. They want to figure out ways to solve these challenges: energy security, resource availability, climate change. And you know, there's a huge demand for this, and if they could just be led or directed in a certain direction, I think you'd have a lot of people signing up to want to do this. You know, the old saying, you make no small plans, they fail to stir men's souls. You know, you have to, if you give people a good idea and a way forward, I think people would sign up in a second, and you'd get a lot more people going into these heavy scientific fields.
Maybe I'll add one more point on this, is that, example is classic here today, that I have met so many fusion people in the fission industry, it's not funny. And I know the fission industry has a challenge with workforce training and attracting people into the field. I mean, I've had teams of people come from fission companies to visit us in General Fusion, and every single one of them started their career in fusion that came to the meeting. So it's a great way to bring people into this field, these sciences, is to attract people with these big ideas.
A lot of the plasma trained people from the universities, the fusion funding trained, have gone off into other plasma related industries. There's a lot of plasma in industry these days, having nothing to do with fusion. You know, you go from plasma televisions to various ways of etching chips to plasma torches for destroying waste. You know, there's just a whole slew of applications for plasma physics and plasma trained people out there in industry, but it's not in the energy area.
Hello, so I'm Caroline Worden. I'm the fusion intern here at ASP. I just got my physics degree from Berkeley in undergrad, so I suppose I'm part of that next generation of fusion scientists that you've been talking about. So my question to you is, what prospects, if any, are there for a big fusion experiment to happen in the US in the next 10 years? Considering that with the FESAC draft, we're looking at maybe one big tokamak experiment still being around in 10 years' time. So is that something that I can look forward to in my career, or should I be looking more into private sector, or should I move to Germany and work on the stellarator there?
I should comment that Caroline Worden is the daughter of one of the premier fusion scientists from Los Alamos, who was one of the inventors of the concept, which Mike's company is working on. In fact, I think he had something to do with encouraging you guys somewhere along
He's
the line.
been a good partner for us, for sure.
But to answer your question, which I don't know really has a good answer, there is no plan in the U.S. in the strategic plan to build a new fusion plasma physics device, other than to keep operating the two that we now have, one at Princeton, one at General Atomics, and you may wind up having to decide if you want to actually do experimental work on a fusion machine, spending some time overseas. But Mark, would you comment?
Well, I just put an asterisk on that.
Yeah.
And you sort of highlighted it. There are certainly groups within the fusion community that have plans and have promoted plans and are trying to get, in essence, the government's attention to build a major machine or what are called a fusion nuclear science facility, moving on to a pilot plant and whatnot. The issue is really, it's not the lack of trying in the community, it's the government's response or lack of response to that.
There is a small chance, I would say there is a small chance that Princeton will be allowed to build the stellarator. They have the stellarator basically all there in pieces. They were not allowed to put it together, and they would like to put it together. At the moment, it's not in the plan, it's not in the draft, although it's mentioned. But don't discount the possibility that Princeton will be able to get the approval to put that stellarator together, in which case there'll be a stellarator at Princeton.
Well, and I would add too that things. The old saying, a year's a long time in politics. A lot of things change awfully quickly. Look at our panel earlier today on natural gas, LNG, and everything like that. If we had had that panel 10 years ago, it would have been all about how we could have been building more LNG import terminals, not export terminals. It would have been, where we could find secure new supplies of natural gas to bring in. And so things change as technology changes, the politics changes, and I think a growing awareness that fusion is real, happening now, and increasingly possible, could lead to a breakthrough. The dam breaks and then suddenly everything happens. I'm not saying that that's necessarily going to happen, and Carolyn, I don't know if you base your career around it, but you know, we're going to be out there banging that drum and trying to get it out there. Because I think that the important thing to remember is the promise is so great, right? What is fusion? It's a source of essentially unlimited energy over the long term, however you do it, whether it's inertial laser fusion, whether it's magnetic fusion, whether it's the alternative concepts down the middle. The promise of this is so important and so great for our economic security, for our national security, for global stability, all of these sorts of things. It's kind of a question of how can you not invest in this and how can you not do this. So it's an important thing that we just have to continue to bang the drum on and remind everybody here in Washington and capitals around the world that this is too important to ignore.
So you stole my thunder a little bit. I was going to end the panel with sort of any last words that you guys wanted to say, but also to end on a positive note, to sort of lay out the landscape. What does the world look like when fusion is actually commercialized, when we have this available, when it's connected up and providing energy? Why are we doing this? Mike, you can start.
Sure. The experts, Andrew's going to be more of an expert than on some of these issues than I am, but fusion does hold out that big promise, and there is reason to want to have that promise. It has an essentially unlimited fuel supply. It does produce zero emissions through operation. It doesn't have the same long-lived waste profiles that fission does through its spent fuel, although it does have some. It also could change geopolitics in a certain way, in that there are studies that show it doesn't have the proliferation risks that fission does. I mean, that anytime you're making neutrons, it's possible you can use that for proliferation, but it probably is a lot easier if you want to do it a different way. So, the whole point about a carbon-free world and how geopolitics would change if we weren't an oil-dominated economy, that's the prospect that fusion holds out in the medium to long term.
I might comment that one of the criticisms of ITER is it's so big and expensive that no one country felt they could afford to build it on their own. But there are concepts around to try to make the next tokamak or some tokamak a lot smaller than that. For example, the size of this machine is basically determined by what's the largest magnetic field you can make with today's superconductors, which have to operate at like liquid helium temperatures. But one of the companies that Mike put on his graph there, Tokamak Energy over in the UK, has built a small tokamak using high temperature superconductors, which operate at the liquid nitrogen temperatures and can go maybe to twice the magnetic field that ITER's going. Where you go twice the magnetic field, they have designs then to make an ITER-like machine that's half the size of ITER and maybe a fourth of the cost. So there's a lot of technology advances that might be coming along that will impact the landscape. Because if ITER is representative of how much it's going to cost to go on from here on the tokamak line, it's not going. It's not going much farther.
Yeah, and I would agree. When you say what's the world look like in this, it's hard to say. It's always hard to tell the future. But this is an important thing to remember, that if you look at the split between where we need to go in terms of climate change, in terms of the reduction in emissions, how you get there without, we talked about nuclear in the previous panel, or fusion in this panel. I can see virtually no way to do it and remain a high energy economy and move towards an even higher energy economy in the medium to long term. So that's why ASP has gotten involved in fusion. That's why we think it's so important and necessary to be talking about this sort of stuff, to get to a world where you don't have to think about the national security and economic implications of protecting oil supply lines and all of this sort of associated things. The promise is great and the challenge is great, but it hasn't stopped us before.
30 or 40 years ago, Johnny Foster, who was the director of Livermore and a vice president of TRW, said that time is on the side of fusion. And we didn't say how long that time was. Herald Firth, who was a director of the Princeton Physics Laboratory, once said that we will have fusion 10 years after the government decides we need it.
Yeah, well, on that optimistic note, there's lots more questions I have about, how utilities are involved in this or not involved, and general information, but we're at our time limit. So thank you so much for sticking with us and for joining us here today.